With me in studio is Anat Balint, a media analyst and journalist with the Seventh Eye in Israel. Good morning to you. As well as Jake Wirtschafter, i24News correspondent in Cairo. Good morning to you. And of course, Ami Kaufman, who's our press man in many ways when he doesn't host the road to the White House. But I want to start with you, Jake, because you are fresh in from Cairo and you're usually based there. A place that is difficult to report from, one may say, in many ways. And President Sisi, wants the media there to reflect an official point of view. It's something he actually said. How can one operate then?
Right. So Egyptian journalists are operating basically in the same conditions that journalists in the rest of our neighborhood are. I mean, we are all, this part of the world is, Tom doesn't want to say, but Reporters Without Borders will.
Right.
And so, Lebanon and Tunisia are ranking ahead of Israel and Palestine and Jordan, and Egypt is ranking below Jordan and ahead of Saudi Arabia. In all of the countries I mentioned, there's a state campaign against what it calls terrorism, or what is terrorism. And under the rubric of that campaign against terrorism, we're seeing incredibly harsh and restrictive measures being put on reporting on conflict, or reporting on the difference between the state and different segments of the state that are in opposition to it.
That are in opposition in many, many ways. But it's interesting what you mentioned about Tunisia and, being ahead of certain places in the Middle East. And monitored media, I mean, a second Tahrir Square, that's one thing I want to ask you. Sorry, a third Tahrir Square. That is not possible these days, I'm assuming.
Journalists in Egypt are regulated. You need a press card, you need permission from the Ministry of Information to operate as a journalist, you need permission to photograph or videotape in any location prior to showing up there to do a stand-up or to shoot. And part of the problem today that you're seeing at the press syndicate, where a couple days ago the police raided the journalists union, is that there's confusion with the online world now about who is permitted press and who is not permitted press. And there's also a problem in Egypt about opinion versus reporting. And so, for instance, this controversy now over the islands, whether or not they belong to Saudi Arabia or Egypt.
Whether they belong to Egypt.
There's a lot of, there's some confusion whether or not reporters are advocating for a position or whether or not they're reporting on the facts of the case.
The facts of the case. And I think that's a perfect time when you're talking about this islands back in the region, is to look specifically at freedom of the press here in Israel. And here in Israel, actually, there was a downgrading for the freedom of the press, so to speak.
Yeah. Do you want to start with the good news or the bad news?
What is the good news?
Yeah, you didn't realize that there are good news. Well, according to the Freedom House annual ranking of freedom of press in 200 countries in the world.
Right.
So in the Middle East, Israel is the most free country when you look at freedom of press.
As the administration likes to say.
But that is not a compliment.
Compared to Tunisia and Lebanon, we're ranking higher.
Yeah. No, we're the most free
supposedly
in the Middle East. But that's like being kind of the best student in kind of
in
class
the worst class.
Morons. Sorry to say that. Yeah. So let's go to the bad news, which are much more significant. And I don't agree with the Tom Law. I think it's very important to put a finger and say where are we ranking and what's the situation and what are the reasons for the fact that Israel was defined as partly free, like having a partly free press. So we like to think of ourselves as like a thriving democracy in the Middle East, but basically when this organization, Freedom House, looks from outside, he says this country doesn't have a full freedom of press here, but only partly free. That's the third time we're defined like that, and there are two reasons. They point at two reasons for that. The first one, and I'm surely this has been discussed here before, is the phenomena of Israel Hayom.
Yeah, Israel Hayom, I mean, it's important to explain Israel Hayom once again, that Ami and I touch on daily.
Daily, we touch on it.
Yeah, I'm sure you mentioned here a lot.
No, I mean, it's a newspaper owned by Sheldon Adelson.
It's free.
It's free.
I personally, I don't think it should be defined as a newspaper. It's basically a propaganda arm financed by Sheldon Adelson to support his
Al-Haram in Cairo is more independent of Sisi than Israel Hayom is
Sorry?
Netanyahu.
He said Al-Haram in Egypt is more independent of Al-Sisi.
Right. So you know, let's put it straightforward. It's a propaganda arm. It's not a real newspaper in the sense that we know it as journalists and think of a newspaper reporting news. And that's probably the most harmful phenomena in Israel media landscape.
Is that one of the reasons for the downgrading?
It's the number one reason. And
actually, I think, by the way, Anat, you can tell us that I think the Seventh Eye over the years has done a lot of great work covering this issue and how they show the kind of close relations between the editorial room and decision makers in the Netanyahu government.
Right. So the Seventh Eye was almost the only platform today in Israel that can independently cover these issues of Israel Hayom and its damaging effect and how it is closely related to Netanyahu and decision maker in the Prime Minister office. And the second reason is what is known in recent years as native advertising or surreptitious advertising, which became totally wild in Israel and penetrated main media and news outlets like Ynet, which is the most popular news outlet
online.
Online.
But that's global. I mean, that's what BuzzFeed is too.
Exactly. I mean, that's something that's going on around the world.
It's different in many ways, and one of the reasons Israel was pointed out as having a serious problem is that government offices started to stream millions of shekels through native advertising to put across their messages in news.
In news, and that's why I mean it's going from infotainment into straight commercial. Yeah. And there's all we can't. I mean we cannot ignore the Palestinian-Israeli story, and in that effect also Palestinian journalists. And
you know what? We can't ignore it, but in fact, Freedom House did ignore it. Exactly. Freedom House did not mention Palestinian journalists. On the one hand, this kind of makes sense because Palestinian journalists are not citizens of
any
Israel.
country.
But on the other hand, they are working in territories that are controlled by Israel, by the IDF. So they do not have the same protections or legal protections that an Israeli journalist has that is working in the same area. And this is kind of a blind spot that Freedom House had. It didn't mention that at all. Their response to this, to the questions that were made, is that this is because we only talk about Israel proper, but you know, you have to look at basically all the territories. I think that Israel is ruling, and it comes on the heels, I think, of what we're of this report that we saw. We talked about earlier in Haaretz, the front page of Haaretz, and also the report about the 6 Palestinian journalists that are currently in administrative detention, and over 19 that have been arrested in the last month or two.
Under the argument of incitement in some ways, one can know. We're not being told.
But also connections with terrorist organizations, what the IDF calls terrorist activity.
You're right on me, but I was in Bethlehem yesterday speaking to a young Palestinian journalist, and she said she does not want to work for a Palestinian newspaper or news organization. She's desperately looking for a job for a Western one, and that's because she feels that the standards of objectivity and looking for facts and real reporting are undervalued in the Palestinian press inside Area A.
No, it's a very valid point. One can see also in Israel. And I've got the Oscar music in my ear, and not Balint. I want to thank you from the Seventh Eye for joining us and all of us. Now the news.